of water, dark water, seawater.
Do you believe Natalie Wood was murdered?
I think it's suspicious enough to make us think that something happened.
On the night of November 28, 1981, Natalie Wood boarded the yacht Splendour near California's Santa Catalina Island with her husband, actor Robert Wagner, her Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken, and the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern. Wood was 43 and still a major Hollywood star, with 3 Oscar nominations behind her. During a break from filming Brainstorm, she was spending Thanksgiving weekend at sea. By the following morning, she would be dead. Now, as the investigation has opened up again after 45 years, we are revisiting the moment Christopher Walken broke his silence and revealed what happened on Natalie Wood's boat. But to make any sense of this story, we must start from the very beginning. The last night on the Splendour, 4 people, 1 missing woman. The evening began publicly enough. It was supposed to be a getaway for 4 people who already carried years of complicated relationships, professional ambitions, jealousy, and unresolved tension onto the Splendour. Wood was 43, one of Hollywood's most recognizable actresses, and she was on Catalina Island with her husband Robert Wagner, her Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken, and Captain Dennis Davern. Wagner and Wood had a long, complicated marriage. They had divorced, remarried, and built a family together. But by 1981, their relationship had endured its share of strain. Walken, meanwhile, was not some random guest. He was Wood's co-star in Brainstorm, an actor whose career was rising rapidly after his Academy Award for The Deer Hunter. Wagner later acknowledged that he felt insecure about Walken and about the closeness between Walken and Wood on the film. The tension had apparently been building before the final night. According to Davern's later account, the atmosphere aboard the yacht became increasingly uncomfortable as the Thanksgiving weekend progressed, with alcohol adding to the volatility. After the group returned to the Splendour, the accounts separate sharply. Wagner later said Wood had gone to the master cabin and that the last time he saw her, she was at the bathroom vanity, fixing her hair. He said he eventually went to bed and assumed she had taken the small inflatable dinghy ashore. Davern later disputed that account. Walken's version was different again. He said he went to his cabin and did not know what happened to Wood. Then came the detail that transformed a disappearance into a mystery. The dinghy was gone too. Wood was not aboard the Splendour. A ship-to-shore call was made at about 1:30 in the morning, and the Coast Guard was alerted later, around 3:30. The yacht was anchored near the isthmus of Catalina Island, and the weather and darkness would later matter, because investigators had to consider how easily a person could disappear from sight in those conditions. At around 8 the next morning, Wood's body was found approximately 1 mile from the yacht, floating face down in the Pacific near Blue Cavern Point. She was wearing a flannel nightgown, a red down jacket, and blue wool socks. Nearby, the 13-foot inflatable dinghy, Prince Valiant, had washed onto rocks. Its ignition was off, its gear shift was in neutral, and its oars were secured. The original coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, concluded that she had died from accidental drowning. But even that conclusion left a question hanging over the entire case. How exactly did Wood enter the Pacific? Christopher Walken later supplied one possible answer. The dinghy theory, the accident that could explain everything. In 1986, when people asked him about Natalie Wood's death, Walken gave a remarkably curt answer. He said he did not know what happened, that she slipped and fell into the water, and that he had been in bed. 11 years later, in a Playboy interview, he went further. He began thinking through the geography of the yacht, the darkness, the rain, and the little inflatable dinghy tied alongside it. Maybe, he suggested, Wood had gone outside because the dinghy was banging against the Splendour. It was late at night off Catalina Island. The Splendour was sitting in the darkness, and alongside it was a small inflatable tender, the kind of boat that can knock repeatedly against a larger yacht as the water moves beneath them. Wood did not need to have planned a trip ashore. She could simply have heard the banging, stepped outside in the clothes she was wearing, and leaned over to deal with the problem. One movement goes wrong. The dinghy shifts. A foot slips. Suddenly, she is in the Pacific. Walken's theory has an unnerving simplicity because it does not require a conspiracy, a fight, or even another person to be standing beside her. But simplicity is not proof, and there was, at least initially, physical evidence that seemed to give the accident theory some weight. The dinghy, a small Valiant inflatable known as Prince Valiant, was eventually found along the island's shoreline, separate from the Splendour. The original investigation considered scratches reported on its side potentially consistent with Wood trying to climb aboard after entering the water. Chief Medical Examiner Thomas Noguchi's reconstruction was that Wood had fallen into the water and struggled to get into the dinghy, possibly becoming exhausted and hypothermic before drowning. But here is where the story becomes much more interesting. The evidence used to support that theory could never ultimately prove that Wood had been the person who made those scratches. Her fingernails had not been preserved for later analysis. And when investigators reopened the case decades later, they could no longer locate the dinghy itself for a fresh forensic examination. Then came the body. Wood was found roughly a mile from the Splendour, while the dinghy was recovered separately. That distance does not disprove an accident. A person in the ocean and a small inflatable boat can drift independently, but it creates a sequence that has to be explained. If Wood fell while trying to handle the dinghy, did she actually get hold of it? Did she attempt to climb aboard? Did the dinghy drift away from her? And if she was struggling in the water, why didn't anybody aboard the yacht immediately realize what was happening? Also, Wood was found wearing a nightgown, a red down jacket, and blue wool socks. That might sound strange if we imagine her deliberately preparing to take the dinghy somewhere, but it is perfectly possible that she stepped outside in whatever she was wearing after hearing a noise. The clothing, therefore, cannot tell us whether she intended to go ashore or merely intended to secure the tender. What it does establish is that, whatever happened, Wood entered the water without being dressed for a normal nighttime outing. And then, the mystery became even more complicated. The injuries, the bruises, and the moment the case stopped looking simple. When Natalie Wood's body was examined in Los Angeles on November 29, 1981, Chief Medical Examiner Thomas Noguchi documented superficial bruises on her extremities and abrasions on the left side of her face. He also noted no evidence of strangulation and wrote that foul play was not suspected at the time. The original interpretation was that the injuries could have happened as Wood struggled in the water or attempted to climb back onto a boat. On paper, the case still looked like an accident, but the details were more complicated than that conclusion suggested. Wood had fresh bruising on her right forearm, injuries around her left wrist, and bruising around her right knee, along with a scratch on her neck and superficial abrasions on her forehead and face. Those injuries did not prove that someone had attacked her, because a person falling into the water, striking the yacht or dinghy, and then struggling in the Pacific could sustain multiple injuries. That was precisely the problem. The wounds had several possible explanations, and the original investigation could not establish exactly when or how they occurred. Then, the case sat for decades. The physical evidence became frozen in time, while memories changed and witnesses reconsidered what they had said. When the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department reopened the investigation in November 2011, detectives went back through the old autopsy and questioned some of the original investigators. But they immediately encountered a devastating limitation. Some evidence that might have helped answer the questions was no longer available. The dinghy itself could not be located for renewed examination, and Wood's fingernail clippings had not been preserved. Investigators, therefore, could not simply recreate the original scene and test whether she had fought with someone or damaged the dinghy while trying to climb aboard. The new forensic review nevertheless changed the weight of the bruises. In a supplemental report completed in June 2012, Chief Medical Examiner Coroner Lakshmanan Satyavagaswaran examined the distribution and number of Wood's injuries and concluded that some of the bruising could have occurred before she entered the water. That was significant because it weakened the certainty of the original explanation that the injuries were simply consequences of drowning or trying to climb back aboard. The report said that the available evidence could not exclude a non-accidental mechanism. One detective later put the suspicion more bluntly. Los Angeles County Sheriff's investigator Ralph Hernandez said the injuries made Wood look like a victim of an assault. But even that dramatic statement was not a forensic conclusion that homicide had occurred. Investigators were confronting a problem that would define the entire reopened case. Bruises can demonstrate injury, but they do not automatically reveal the person, object, sequence, or intention responsible for that injury. A mark on an arm can be evidence of violence, but it can also result from an accidental impact. There was another clue that made the accident theory harder to settle. The later coroner's review considered the distribution of the injuries, the absence of significant head trauma, and the lack of substantial facial injury. All of this supported the possibility that at least some of the bruising occurred before she entered the water. Think about what that means physically. If the bruises had clearly been concentrated on areas one would expect to strike a boat during a straightforward fall, say obvious impact injuries from hitting the yacht or dinghy, the accident explanation would be easier to defend. Instead, investigators were looking at multiple injuries distributed across her body, including bruising on the arms, a scratch on the neck, and abrasions to the face. The medical examiner could not establish that these were inflicted by another person, but their distribution made it harder to confidently say that every injury happened after she entered the Pacific. The absence of major head trauma was particularly important to the reasoning. If the theory was that Wood simply slipped, fell, struck the yacht, and became incapacitated, you might expect some substantial impact injury depending on exactly how the fall occurred, but the later examiner did not find that kind of decisive head injury. At the same time, there was no substantial facial bruising that could neatly explain the other injuries as one catastrophic impact. Instead, there were several comparatively superficial injuries in different locations. That does not mean someone beat her. It means the medical evidence did not provide a single obvious accidental event capable of accounting for everything. And this is where the language of the coroner's report becomes fascinating. The examiner did not write that the injuries demonstrated homicide. He wrote that their location and multiplicity supported bruising having occurred before Wood entered the water. There was also a timing problem. The later review estimated that Wood probably died around midnight, while she was not reported missing until approximately 1:30 in the morning. The medical examiner noted that she appeared to have drowned relatively quickly. That made the sequence harder to reconstruct. If some injuries occurred before she entered the water, what event caused them? And how much time passed between that event and the drowning? In August 2012, more than 30 years after Wood's death, her death certificate was amended. The original classification of accidental drowning was replaced with drowning and other undetermined factors. The amended document specifically stated that the circumstances of how Wood ended up in the water were not clearly established. The medical examiner wrote that because there were unanswered questions and limited additional evidence available for evaluation, the manner of death should remain undetermined. Even investigators who suspected something more serious acknowledged that they had not proved a crime. The Los Angeles Times reported that detectives faced an impasse. The evidence was old, memories had faded, and the forensic record was incomplete. They could not establish homicide, but they could no longer establish accident either. There are more complications as well. The captain changes his story, and homicide enters the investigation.
Why you would change your story after all of these years?
Well, it's not that I've really changed my story. In the very beginning, I told the police what happened that night, but I failed to tell them everything.
The first person to seriously disrupt the original accident narrative was Dennis Davern, the captain of the Splendour. For years, the official story remained essentially unchanged. Natalie Wood had accidentally gone into the water, and the 43-year-old actress had drowned. Then, Davern began saying that the story he had given police in 1981 was false. He admitted that he had lied to investigators and said that the version given immediately after Wood's death had been shaped to protect Robert Wagner. In 2011, Davern publicly urged authorities to reopen the case, saying he believed Wagner had been responsible for Wood's death. Just let those words sink in. But you see, Davern's new account came with an enormous problem: his own credibility. This was not simply a witness remembering an overlooked detail. He was substantially changing his story 3 decades later. Davern said that after Wood disappeared, he had failed to tell investigators what he really believed had happened. He later claimed that Wagner had fought with Wood shortly before she vanished and had then impeded the search for her. In one account, Davern said he heard shouting and what sounded like a physical struggle inside the yacht. The sounds then moved toward the back of the boat, and then they suddenly stopped. His description of the evening was far more dramatic than the original investigation. Davern said Wagner and Walken had already argued after Wagner became jealous of Walken's relationship with Wood, and he described Wagner smashing a wine bottle during that confrontation.
Davern, who spoke to 48 Hours in 2011, says it was a tension-filled weekend fueled by alcohol and Wagner's jealousy of Wood's co-star, actor Christopher Walken.
Wagner eventually acknowledged the broken bottle in his 2008 memoir, but gave a different explanation. He said he had broken it during an argument with Walken about Wood's career, while Wood was below deck. The jealousy did not come out of nowhere, and that is what makes the relationship between Robert Wagner, Natalie Wood, and Christopher Walken so important to understanding what happened next. By the time Brainstorm went into production in North Carolina in 1981, Wood and Wagner were already living through a remarkably complicated marriage. They had first married in 1957, divorced in 1962, and then remarried in 1972. They had 2 young daughters together, and Wood was trying to rebuild the acting career she had deliberately stepped away from for several years. Then came Christopher Walken. He was younger than Wagner, newly celebrated after winning the Academy Award for The Deer Hunter, and suddenly spending long hours with Wood on a film in which they played emotionally intimate characters. Wagner later wrote that something about the situation began bothering him. He described feeling that Wood was becoming increasingly absorbed in the production and in Walken, to the point that he felt she was being emotionally unfaithful. Wood and Walken were not simply playing colleagues in Brainstorm. Their characters were romantically involved, and the film included an intimate love scene between them. To a jealous husband watching from outside the production, that was hardly an abstract situation. Wood was an experienced actress, but she was also returning to a profession that mattered deeply to her, while Walken was encouraging her to pursue that career seriously. Director Douglas Trumbull later recalled the production differently from the rumors surrounding it. In the documentary, Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind, he said he saw very little genuine romantic chemistry between Wood and Walken during the intimate scene. In his 2008 memoir, Wagner described Walken as an exciting actor and recalled becoming increasingly uneasy about the amount of attention Wood was giving the production. He wrote about a little bell going off in his head, sensing that he did not have Wood's full attention. That gives the jealousy a different dimension. That broken bottle is where the competing stories begin to separate dramatically. Wagner's version was that Wood had already gone below deck by the time he and Walken were arguing. He said the discussion became increasingly angry. He smashed the bottle, and eventually the argument ended. Later, when he went below, he said he found Wood at the vanity in their cabin, apparently preparing for bed. If that account is correct, the explosive confrontation ended with Wagner and Walken, while Wood was already removed from it. Dennis Davern's later account, however, was much darker. The Splendour's captain eventually claimed that Wagner's anger was not simply about career advice. Davern said Wagner was jealous of the attention Wood was giving Walken, and described the atmosphere aboard the yacht as increasingly volatile. His later version placed a serious confrontation between Wagner and Wood after Wood went below deck, with Davern claiming he heard sounds that suggested something more than an argument. Investigators later said this version was significant because it potentially placed a confrontation between Wagner and Wood immediately before her disappearance. But again, Davern said he heard what sounded like a struggle. He did not provide eyewitness testimony of exactly what occurred inside the cabin. He could not have, because he did not see it. Then came the question of the search itself. According to Davern, after Wood disappeared, Wagner did not immediately initiate the kind of emergency search investigators would expect for someone missing from a yacht at night. Davern later described a decision not to search too aggressively, not to turn on the searchlight, and not to immediately notify authorities. Investigators examining the case decades later became particularly interested in the timeline because Wagner's own account placed him as aware that Wood was missing considerably earlier than the eventual Coast Guard notification. Lieutenant John Corina later said that, in his view, a missing wife and a missing dinghy should have prompted an immediate search, especially in dark conditions. And then investigators found something that made Davern's story harder to dismiss entirely. People who had been in the vicinity of the Splendour that night provided additional accounts. One woman, Marilyn Wayne, said she heard cries for help coming from the direction of the yacht and reported hearing a male voice. She said she and her companion contacted authorities but did not receive the response they expected. By 2018, investigators said they had found 2 additional witnesses whose accounts they considered credible. Lieutenant Corina told CBS that one witness claimed to have heard the confrontation and another said she had actually seen part of it. Investigators said those accounts were consistent with important elements of Davern's later story and inconsistent with some of Wagner's versions of events. Then came the most dramatic official escalation: Wagner, Walken, and the 2 stories that never met. The mystery becomes much stranger when the 3 surviving accounts are placed beside one another because they do not simply disagree about one detail. They describe 3 very different levels of knowledge about what happened aboard the Splendour. Robert Wagner maintained that he did not know how Natalie Wood ended up in the water. His explanation was that Wood had gone to deal with the dinghy, which was making noise against the yacht, and that she may have slipped while trying to secure it. Decades later, he still described her death as an accident. He believed she may have hit her head on the swim step and become unable to get back aboard, while also acknowledging that he could never know exactly what happened. Christopher Walken's account is remarkably close to that basic accident theory, but with one crucial difference. He did not claim to know how Wood entered the water. In a 1986 People interview, Walken said he did not know what happened, and that Wood had slipped and fallen into the water while he was in bed. Years later, he offered the possibility that she may have gone outside because the dinghy was banging against the yacht. But this was a reconstruction, not eyewitness testimony. Then there was Dennis Davern, and his story took the investigation in a completely different direction. The Splendor's captain initially participated in the accident narrative, but decades later, he admitted that he had lied to investigators in 1981.
Dennis, what happened that night? Was there an argument on the yacht?
Yes, that night there was an argument. Actually started the day before. That particular night,
He subsequently alleged that Wagner and Wood had a violent argument shortly before her disappearance, and that Wagner failed to respond appropriately once she was missing. Investigators considered Davern important, but also problematic. He had changed his account, had publicly promoted his version of events, and had financial and publicity interests surrounding the story. Yet, detectives later said portions of what he told them were corroborated by other witnesses. By January 2013, investigators said they had interviewed more than 100 people and had repeatedly attempted to speak with Wagner. Christopher Walken, meanwhile, had spoken with detectives for approximately an hour and provided a prepared statement. Wagner's attorney disputed the characterization that he had refused to cooperate. He said that Wagner had been interviewed multiple times over the preceding decades and had answered investigators' questions. But for the reopened investigation specifically, Lieutenant John Corina said detectives had attempted to interview Wagner at least 10 times and had been unsuccessful. Then in 2018, investigators said 2 people who had not previously been part of the official investigation described hearing a confrontation around the Splendour, and one reportedly said she saw part of it. Lieutenant Corina called those witnesses very credible and said their accounts matched important elements of Davern's story. Investigators also said those accounts did not match Wagner's versions of events. That did not establish murder, but it dramatically changed the evidentiary landscape. The sheriff's department then described Wood's death as a suspicious death and said investigators had not been able to prove whether it was homicide or accident. Detective Ralph Hernandez made the central problem explicit. investigators still did not know how Wood had ended up in the water. Even more remarkably, investigators considered whether someone might have known she was in the water and failed to save her, but explained that this alone would not necessarily establish criminal liability. Then came February 1st, 2018. And now, 45 years later, after 6 years of reinvestigating the case, Los Angeles County Sheriff's Lieutenant John Carina told 48 Hours, "As we've investigated the case over the last 6 years, I think he's more of a person of interest now." Then he gave the reason in unusually direct terms. "We know now that he was the last person to be with Natalie before she disappeared." But Carina was not saying investigators had discovered a murder weapon, a confession, or a forensic breakthrough tying Wagner to Wood's death. The designation came from the accumulation of unresolved questions surrounding the final hours. Detectives said Wagner's version did not match all the other accounts they had gathered. Carina put it bluntly, "I haven't seen him tell the details that match all the other witnesses in this case." He added, "I think he's constantly changed his story a little bit," and said, "His version of events just don't add up." The timing was particularly important. By 2018, detectives were no longer working only with Dennis Davern's controversial later account. They said 2 additional witnesses had emerged after the case was reopened. According to Detective Ralph Hernandez, one witness reported seeing figures on the back of the Splendour and recognizing the voices as Wagner and Wood. Both witnesses reportedly heard an argument, and investigators said their accounts matched important elements of Davern's story. Carina described them as very credible and said they had no reason to lie. But even those witnesses did not provide the missing moment. Carina made that limitation extraordinarily clear. No one saw anybody go in the water. Nobody heard a splash. What they had, according to investigators, was evidence of an argument followed by silence. So far, Walken's version remains one of the least dramatic explanations, and precisely for that reason, one worth testing. His theory was that the dinghy was bouncing against the yacht and making noise, and Wood may have gone outside to move or secure it. The possibility is physically plausible. The original investigation itself concluded that Wood had accidentally drowned, and the dinghy theory was consistent with the idea that she had fallen while trying to deal with it. Nothing in Walken's later explanation establishes that this is what actually happened, but it provides a mechanism. A woman goes outside alone at night, encounters a slippery section of the yacht, loses her footing, and falls into the water. But the physical evidence begins pushing back. Detective Ralph Hernandez said, "We have not been able to prove that this was a homicide, and we haven't been able to prove that this was an accident either." He then identified the central problem. The ultimate problem is we don't know how she ended up in the water. Investigators also wanted to speak with Wagner again. According to Carina, Wagner had declined to participate in a new investigative interview after the case was reopened. Carina said, "I haven't seen him tell the details that match." The other witnesses and indicated detectives had repeatedly sought additional answers. But Wagner's refusal itself cannot be treated as evidence of guilt. A person declining an interview is not an admission, and the investigators still needed evidence capable of establishing what actually happened. Then, the momentum stopped. In May 2022, Sheriff's Lieutenant Hugo Reynaga said that all leads in the Natalie Wood case have been exhausted, and the case remains an open, unsolved case. Reynaga added that if genuinely new leads emerged in the future, the case could be reassigned for investigation. Contemporary reporting described this as Wagner being cleared of involvement, effectively ending the period in which investigators had publicly treated him as a person of interest. So where does the case stand now? The death remains officially unresolved. Wood's death certificate still records drowning and other undetermined factors, rather than a confirmed homicide or accidental death. Wagner was never charged, and the Sheriff's Department exhausted the investigative leads it had developed. Christopher Walken cooperated with the renewed investigation. Wagner did not agree to a new investigative interview. Dennis Davern's later allegations remain part of the investigative history, but his admitted earlier dishonesty and changing account remain significant limitations. And that leaves the case in an unusual legal and investigative limbo. The authorities have not declared Robert Wagner responsible for Natalie Wood's death. They have not established that she was murdered. They have not restored the original accidental drowning conclusion either. The official position is essentially that Natalie Wood drowned, but the circumstances that put her into the water remain undetermined. And unless genuinely new evidence emerges, that is where the investigation stands. After more than 4 decades, the final minutes of Natalie Wood's life are still missing from the record, somewhere between the Splendour, the drifting dinghy, and the dark water surrounding Catalina Island. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If you did, please consider liking, dropping a comment, and hitting the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on our new uploads. Also, don't miss this video you see on your screen right now. It's truly unbelievable.